Hello, everyone. It's Patricia Warby here from Alchemy Therapies, and today I want to talk about trauma. I want to talk about how it affects the body and the mind, what we now refer to as the body mind, because they're not separate. But I specifically want to address the nature of trauma because people think trauma is very specific things, and in fact, it can be anything that overwhelms you. Now, this weekend in the UK, we had the tragic news of the loss of TV presenter and doctor Michael Mosley, who went missing last Wednesday on his holiday with his wife in the Greek island of Symi. And after a few days of not finding him, we all feared the worst because the temperatures there were 40 degrees on the day he went missing and had been very high in the afternoons. So to survive days without water or food seemed very unlikely. And unfortunately, that was the case as he was found, well, minutes from being able to get to the sea, but he unfortunately didn't make it and presumably died of dehydration, although it's not certain at the moment. It is natural causes, according to recent reports. And my heart goes out to his wife and family. But the reason I wanted to talk about this, obviously, because I didn't know Michael, I was very, I was a big fan of his because he was one of the few doctors that talked the language of integrative medicine, of lifestyle medicine, if you like, along with Dr. Chatterjee in the UK. He did a number of programs on changing the diet, for instance, and the 5-2 fasting program, and what's now termed intermittent fasting, which is really powerful for resetting your body. So I was a big fan, although I didn't know him, and his loss is huge, not just for his family, but for those of us who admired and loved what he did. He seemed a very genuine, just a very genuine person. But so that's trauma, obviously, trauma for his family, and I must admit, it really deeply affected me. I was very, very sad and very triggered by it, hearing that he died. And I wanted, therefore, to talk about what triggers are and explore the nature of trauma, really. So, trauma is anything that overwhelms the nervous system. And I can't think of anything worse than saying goodbye to someone and then expecting them to come back later and they never return. And the idea of having, gone on holiday, which is supposed to be a joyful experience, and then coming home without that person, deeply resonates with me. And I think it deeply resonates because of my own trauma when I was a kid and losing my dad. And I went away to university for the first time. It was my first experience, my first year, my first term. And my dad died while I was away, and then coming back, and he wasn't there anymore. And so it's a deeply resonant fear of mine that you go away, or you separate from someone, and then you never see them again. And it's a form of attachment wounding, of course. It's a separation anxiety. And I've done loads of work on this. I really have, to the point where I can talk about it at least without collapsing or being really, really triggered to the point where my heart begins to beat fast and I just feel very anxious. So obviously the work I've done has helped, but it hasn't taken it away. And I was really struck by that over the weekend. My brain just kept going over and over the situation for his wife and family. And so I was really aware, okay, so I've been triggered. So a trigger is anything that reminds the mind body of a situation which has overwhelmed you. So it's a sort of traumatic reenactment, if you like, something happening, a neural sort of resonance in your body, a lighting up of your neural pathways that is based on an implicit memory, a memory that happened to you in the past that you weren't able to process. And therefore, it's never been time stamped as over. And so it continues to sort of trigger you. And I noticed that I am easily triggered by goodbyes, by saying goodbye to someone, or someone leaving, and maybe their return is uncertain. I know I'm a bit of a stickler for when will you be back. I kind of have a nervous system impulse to check that. I'm sure a lot of you listening to this will recognize what I'm saying. We don't do this deliberately. We're not control freaks. We just kind of have this instinct that unless we check something, it might go wrong. And of course, that's the basis of OCD, which I don't suffer from, but I think everything's on a sliding scale anyway. So I'm probably along that spectrum somehow. So the other thing to tell you about trauma is that you can't get over it by willpower. Okay. This is really important. You can't just snap out of it and say, I just need to get my life together and sort myself out and get over it. It was a long time ago. Just get over it. Stop it. Because these messages of panic and fear are generated in the interplay between your back brain and your body. And they're not something that's actually subject to control too much. There's a little bit you can exert over that. But not very much, about 10% from your front thinking brain, the rational brain. And so the effects of trauma, which are many and varied, the classic trauma symptom, flashbacks and sort of disturbances in memory function, where you sort of go into a situation as if it was happening now, are the real extreme ends of what I would call shock trauma, which generally plays out as a sort of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD type symptom. But they are not the most common symptoms that I see day in, day out. Often trauma is buried in sort of neurological impulses in your body, creating pain, fatigue, brain fog, weird neurological symptoms like tingling or numbness, gut issues, really, really common, IBS, all sorts of inflammatory problems, maybe poor digestion. Reflux can be a result of trauma too. There are many and varied physical symptoms that happen because of trauma. And so people can end up in a cycle of being really unwell because their traumatic experiences, first of all, are not acknowledged. They're certainly not experienced as conscious memories, okay? In fact, many people have said to me, I had a good childhood, and I believe them. But there are many things that happen to them that overwhelm them. And so it's not necessary to have had an abusive childhood, to have had childhood trauma. Childhood trauma is by and large an attachment wounding. So something that broke your bonding with usually a parent. It can sometimes come at school with a friend or sometimes a sibling, anyone who you're attached to emotionally that then either betrays you, abandons you, or humiliates you is an attachment wound. And they're so common, but they tend to affect more sensitive people much more than the average person. And so if you have that combination of sensitivity and abandonment wounding, you're likely to be much more predisposed to chronic disease or chronic conditions in your adult life as the neurological impulses kind of break down your tissues and start to inhibit repair and restoration. They may impact your sleep and your kind of mood and create anxiety or depression. Now, I'm working with a number of people at the moment who have these chronic long-term conditions, you know, whether they're straightforward, it's not straightforward, but the one that I most often work with is chronic fatigue syndrome, but there can be pain is more of a symptom, and that can be described as fibromyalgia. But there's also some of the autoimmune diseases like Ehlers-Danlos, for instance, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's. And this is where the body seems to be attacking itself and destroying itself. And of course, that is an imbalance in the autonomic nervous system causing the immune system to run amok. So how do you get out of these things? Because conventionally, they're considered lifelong, that you manage them with drugs, and there's nothing you can do. In fact, doctors will tell you that. the less enlightened ones will tell you there's nothing you can do. And of course, that's not true at all. There's always something you can do, because the body is simply reading that unconscious survival brain, the back brain, messages of implicit threat. And so, first of all, you will not get out of it by trying to fix the problem, right? By using your front brain cognitive, let's research this, let's find more information. You actually have to get out of that state, because it's quite it's busy. The alpha beta brain waves in particular are kind of action oriented, and they will increase your stress level. And particularly when you can't find the solution or the one solution, there are many solutions, of course. It's all multifactorial, and therefore, it's a multiple input issue. But you're never going to get there by willpower. You're never going to get there by focusing purely on the problem and willing yourself to get through that. That isn't how it works. That's how I attacked it. It's how most people attack it, literally. Because when something like that comes along and your body is suddenly flawed and you can't get out of bed, or you can't function in some way, or you're so anxious that you don't know how to deal with stuff, you want to fix that problem. You want to get out of that issue. But it's actually a sort of a stepping back to the bigger picture, as I've talked about in a few previous videos where I've been talking about the difference between left hemisphere and right hemisphere. And both of those are, of course, your thinking brain. And to some degree, you want to get into creative right brain, right hemisphere awareness, for sure. But the other thing is we need to reconnect our bodies, which are largely dissociated through that experience, which is why they're screaming at you. But it's really using the power of imagination. And so getting into your subconscious process, which is why hypnotherapy is very powerful for that. Storytelling, metaphor, anything that uses sensory information. So I use EMDR, which uses eye movements to stimulate memory, but there's also touch. You can do tapping or havening, which I've demonstrated in previous videos. But touch is very powerful because it impacts through the vagus nerve directly into your back brain and will help to overwrite the implicit message of threat that your body is running. Okay, so it's not willpower. It's about connecting with your body and the emotions that you have not been able to metabolize at the time you experience them. So let me give you my example from my life. So I was in my first year, my first term, as I've said, at uni, and my family turn up unexpectedly to see me, all of them. I immediately know this isn't normal. This isn't right. What is this? My brain is trying to scrabble for information. I hear the news, he's died, which is just so unfathomable and so huge for a 19-year-old, or was I even 19? I might have even been 18, to comprehend. And it's happened while I wasn't there. And so I have a degree of guilt, which I carry with me for years over not being there. What do? Well, I do cry initially, but then I go and make a cup of tea for everyone. Okay. And I just do physical stuff. I just put the tea bags in the mugs, and I remember collecting, I don't know, 8 or 9 mugs, and just not saying anything to anybody, because I didn't dare mention it. Because if I said something to someone, I would burst into tears again. And my front brain was saying, get control, do not collapse. You need to function. Now, this is important in the aftermath of a trauma, and I'm sure that happened for Michael's family. You have to do things. There are things now to be done. But further down the line, there's going to need to be some processing, and there was for me. If you believe you have dealt with something cognitively and you haven't dealt with it emotionally, i.e. somatically in the body, there will be a payback at some point in your life. And for me, it was at, I think, 32, roughly, when my body just collapsed. I had been running on adrenaline for years, but particularly in those 2 years, When my relationship broke down at 30 and I was forced to move and leave my animals behind. And I've talked about this before, but I was running on adrenaline for 18 months to 2 years. And then the adrenaline kind of ran out. And that's when my body just caved in. But I hadn't realized how much of the past experience, the overwhelm of that major shift in my life, losing a father, particularly when he's the emotional mainstay for you. He's the one that gets you perhaps in your, well, certainly in my family, might not be in yours, but sometimes it's one parent who you get and they kind of have a bond with. If you're lucky, it'll be both. But some people don't have that because they have these attachment wounds, which I had with my mother. So, something is pulled away and irrevocably changed. How do you deal with that? Initially, you're just going to have to get on and kind of allow yourself to feel, if you can, in the company of someone who feels safe to you. Now, for me, it was various people in my family. I do remember my sister-in-law has always been someone that kind of would hold me in those situations. And I was lucky I had that. Not having a sister, I have two brothers. That seemed for me just the natural response of my body was just to be held in that moment and deal with it in that moment. Later on in my life, it actually had to be telling people around me, the people that love me, that I had been deeply affected by it, but I seemed to not be. But that was just my coping strategy, and to kind of reveal myself a little bit and say, no, it changed everything for me. Of course, it did for them too. But I appeared to be managing that. That was the illusion. So, kind of being able to reveal yourself to someone who feels safe to you is really important, and to be able just to feel the feelings in their presence and not have them judge you or want to compete with you, because that's often the case. Wow, yeah, I had all that and I had more, what about this for a story? And somebody tries to tell you how badly off they are and how deeply wounded they are. That's not sharing. That's kind of competing. And that's a result of internalized shame. Someone just needs to be present with you and allow you to feel without wanting to overlay their story on yours. And that's a rare thing in life. And it certainly doesn't happen in social media. The opposite happens when you're connecting with people online, usually. Quite apart from all the attacking that you will get, there's a lot of shame. There's no real connection there because there's no real somatic connection. Connection is heart to heart. It's feeling the presence of someone and they feeling the presence of you. That can't be done online. Well, it can with video sometimes if you're intentional and you're working one-to-one with somebody, or you're in a group that understands the somatic component. But in general interaction online, you don't get that support. And we're hearing, actually, when we engage online, we're hearing more and more AI voices. I don't know if you've noticed that. The kind of robotic voices that have no prosody, intonation, warmth, because they're just composed of algorithms that read the text and create some semblance of meaning by stopping at the end of a sentence and starting again, but the intonation has no emotionality to it. This actually has a neurobiological effect on us. It shuts down our emotion centers, because what we're hearing, well, let me do an example of robotic voicing. Actually, that was better than the robotic voicing that I hear. Sometimes it's worse than that because it's sort of faster, but it has no connection. And so neurobiologically, how do we respond to that? We feel cut off, we feel disconnected. And so we're surrounded by these messages of disconnect. And if we're ill, of course, we're isolated already, because a lot of our friendships are, maybe our work life drops away or it becomes very, very limited. And we feel so alone with this. And then our mind starts to overwork and we want to solve the problem. And so you can see how people get very, very trapped in these issues of disconnect and fear. And so, how do we get over this? How do we recover our sense of self and our health? Well, as I've said, we can't just do it by wanting to. Obviously, the precursor to anything is to have some decision that you make about wanting to heal, but wanting alone is not enough, because you have to rewire your brain and nervous system in order to recover. And this is the work of psychotherapy, whether it's somatic psychotherapy, which is what I do, or more purely talking therapies, or perhaps psychedelics. The thing you need to understand with trauma is that talking about it doesn't heal it, because, as I've said, the front brain is not really where the trauma is in your back brain. So talking over it, talking about it isn't necessarily going to do it, but actually being heard and felt in the presence of another is how it kind of works. And then you can neurobiologically adjust. It's called neuroception. You change your feeling state within, and perhaps bring down your hyper arousal, that fight and flight system, down into a more equitable, comfortable level where your nervous system, well, here's my slinky, I use this a lot. I find this a really good illustration, but so hypo arousal, that kind of depressive state would be like this. There's not much movement. It feels really awful. Hyper arousal, you're up here, you're bouncing around, you're feeling really unstable, really anxious. What we want, what psychotherapists call the window of tolerance, is a sort of gentle movement in the middle. It sort of corresponds to a feeling safe state. Perhaps, what we would call social engagement in polyvagal theory terms. So being able to connect with others, being able to feel your feelings, but not be overwhelmed by them. And that's an autonomic state, and it needs usually another person to be able to achieve that, because you need to feel felt to get a sense of internal safety. And then bringing parts of your brain back into integration, the felt sense with the thought and cognitive structures, about repatterning your attachment trauma. So feeling loved and held wherever you are, whoever whoever is impacting you in any given moment. If you have a felt sense of safety within, you're much more likely to be able to deal with whatever's coming in your life. By dealing with past traumatic memories, yes, that's really important, because your brain does not know they're over. As I've said, there's a part of your brain that date stamps things, but when you're overwhelmed, that doesn't come online. It's called the hippocampus. So you need to engage that part of you to know it's over. So when I'm working with people, it's usually 18 months to 2 years after at least some event in their lives. Sometimes I work with them on triggers that are more recent, but the originating event usually has to be processed initially, and then you deal with it later. You wouldn't be able to deal with it in the immediate aftermath because you're still in shock. So for me, 18 months to 2 years after my dad died might have been the time to go for psychotherapy, but my family had never done psychotherapy, and indeed regarded it as something for weak people who had mental illness. Makes me shrink to think that now, but that's the times we were in. And I came from the parents of the war generation. So, you didn't bother looking at your problems. You just got on, it was keep calm and carry on. So I didn't even think about that. And I didn't think it would impact me 10, 20 years later. But getting some help is really key, folks. And if you manage to get some somatic or sensory input that overwrites and changes your neurobiology, the symptoms that you're experiencing, whatever they are, be it autoimmune, which is this dysfunction of your nervous system, can actually reverse itself. And I have seen that over and over again. So if anybody tells you you can't recover from these chronic states, they just don't know. They don't have the model, and they don't have the answer to it. It's not deliberate. They're not trying to well, some may be trying to inculcate fear, perhaps to sell you their version of healing, which is usually medication and managing. It's not really healing. Generally speaking, it is possible to heal most things. And I would encourage you to investigate. There is always something you can do. At the very least, you can alleviate some of the symptoms and make life more manageable. So if any of this sounds interesting to you and you would like to investigate, you can find me on alchemytherapies.co.uk. You can find my book, The Scar That Won't Heal, and the Highly Sensitive Handbook, which was released last year. You can find that on Amazon, and look forward to talking to you. Take care, everybody. Bye for now. Bye.